Thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCullum, and I'm here today at Morphy's with a Japanese smoothbore matchlock. This is a gun that is called a Tanegashima, and that name comes from the island at the very southern end of Japan, just south of Kyushu, where the Japanese were first introduced to the matchlock firearm by Portuguese traders in the year 1534. The Japanese certainly recognized the potential and the utility of firearms, and within about 10 years of that first one showing up in the country, these things were in pretty substantial production across Japan. We may think of Japan as a not gun country today, but the samurai absolutely had guns. They had Tanegashima. Now, the whole category of guns, what's interesting here is firearms technology did not really advance in Japan until the mid-1800s. So Japan is open to some trading, but then shuts itself off from the outside world, and this becomes the standard firearm, which becomes the traditional firearm and becomes the only style of firearm that's really manufactured in Japan. They never got the flintlock system. They never got the wheel lock system. Firearms in Japan from the 1500s through about the middle of the 1800s were matchlocks. They were this style that stayed pretty stagnant, pretty stable, whether you want to interpret that as a good thing or a bad thing, throughout the country for like 3 centuries. Now, early on, these were used as major military weapons in large formations, in large military operations. From about 1575 to about 1638, the big battles that took place in Japan took place with large numbers of Tanegashima. Now, after 1638, Japan enters into a much more peaceful period. There's less domestic unrest. They don't have fighting, warlords fighting each other anymore, less like invading of Korea. But the Tanegashima remains in production and remains a weapon at hand for any well-to-do families, for samurai families. Now, this is a pretty standard representative example of a Tanegashima. It's a relatively small caliber one. This is 50 caliber. We'll talk about calibers in a moment, but they had short, basically handgun versions. They had sort of Petronel carbine versions for use on horseback, things that are shorter and thus easier to reload on horseback. And then they had really huge ones that were for things like, well, essentially wall guns, firing from loopholes in castles, firing off of ships, places where you didn't have to lug the thing around, so you could make it a lot bigger. But all of them, regardless of scale, fit this same basic stylistic mold. Now, the one thing I want to talk about before we take a close look is the buttstock of this. You look at this and you're like, how on earth do you shoulder that? Like, what's the deal? The answer is this is actually fired from the cheek. So it is held and fired like this. I don't know how well you can see that. This is not intended to touch the shoulder. And the rationale here is, have you ever looked at a samurai's armor? They're not shouldering a rifle on that stuff. There's way too much stuff going on between the helmet and the shoulder area. There's no place for a rifle buttstock. So this is held 2 points of contact, front hand and the cheek, and it's fired that way. And that was the intention, and that was that remained the standard. That's how Tanegashima were used through the whole 3 centuries of their use in Japan. Now, let's take a closer look at some of the details on his, because it's pretty cool. A quick refresher first, for those of you who aren't familiar with the matchlock concept. The idea here is that you have a muzzle-loaded firearm, so you're going to pour powder down the barrel, a patch, and a ball. And then, like a flintlock, you have a priming pan here, so you're going to pour a little bit of powder here. This hole goes clear through the barrel into the chamber, essentially. You then have a slow-burning match, or fuse, that you pin to this hammer, or cock. Like, it's not really a hammer, because it's not striking anything, it's just holding your burning fuse. When the burning fuse touches the powder, it ignites the powder in the chamber, fires the gun. Now, some of the very early matchlocks were just like a lever connected to this thing, and so when you pull the trigger, you're literally just pulling this slowly down into the powder. Tanegashima are slightly more advanced than that. They have a cocking mechanism, so I would lift the match up like that, and the cock is being held back by that little tab. There is a sear inside that prevents it from rotating until I pull the trigger. which is back here, and that releases this. This is our mainspring that's putting pressure on the cock to drop like that. So that's the fundamental mechanism. By the way, you may notice that there's a big hole in this gun right there. That's not something that's missing. That's where your match goes. So the match is pinned to the front here, comes down here, goes through the gun off to the other side just to hold it in control. And this isn't like cannon fuse. This is like very slow burning match that you can ignite and it will stay smoldering for a long period of time. Now matchlocks can be very dangerous. You have to be very careful when you're loading them because you literally have to have an exposed flame on the gun and you're also pouring black powder into it and pouring powder in here. I should point out this originally had a protective pan cover that would have pivoted on a pin right here. You'd fill the pan and then you could cover it to keep it protected from the elements or from wind blowing powder out of it. But that's unfortunately missing on this one. Now this general style here is standard to all of the Tanegashima, but the details will differ from gun to gun. They're all artisanally made and different regions tended to have different sort of distinctive elements. So some of the guns will have trigger guards like this one. This has sort of a round bulb of a trigger. Some of them have more flat blade triggers, some don't have trigger guards. There are a number of different styles of lock that were used. About 70% of them will have the main spring on the outside, but about 30% are made with the spring on the inside of the lock. The locks are usually brass, but sometimes were made out of steel. And just the style of the springs, the cocks, the side plates, those things varied by region. Same goes for the sights. There were a number of different distinctive styles of sights. This is one of them. Of course, it's got a groove in the top as a rear sight, which actually works better than I expected it to. We have a nice big triangular front sight. This one has a full octagon barrel, and it's a pretty plain muzzle, so there's nothing fancy out here. A lot of the different styles of these would have more decorative, sometimes cannon-style muzzles, but again, that's a regional thing. And of course, there is a wooden ramrod located under the barrel. In fact, you can see here the stock's been made in two pieces so that they can cut the long hole for the ramrod. There are a lot of decorative elements on this gun, and that's very typical. So this one is probably a family crest. That's a normal thing that you would see. And then the other decorations really were based on personal choice. Like, what did you like? Some have animal motifs. This one has plants, flowers on it there. And they go basically all the way out to the muzzle. We've got some cherry blossom. There we go. There's another one. We've got some cherry blossom embossing metal pieces on there. And some more intricate decorative elements here on the back end, the stock end. A couple pieces missing, unfortunately. There was something that was in there that's no longer there. Now, the manufacturing process for a Tanegashima would involve 3 separate craftsmen. You have one guy to make the barrel, one to make the lock, and one to make the stock. The barrels were manufactured by wrapping steel or iron around a central round iron rod. So you take a strip of metal, spiral it around this rod, heat it up. Your blacksmith is the one doing this, and then you hammer it together. Basically hammer weld all of this wrapping together. The larger caliber, fancier, better made ones might have that done twice instead of once, so you have 2 separate layers there. So once the barrel's done, you need a lock. The lock is going to be manufactured by a separate craftsman who's skilled with not so much blacksmithing, but more complex, fine metalwork. These are usually brass, sometimes steel. Like I said, they're all individually made. Your stock maker would then be probably normally a cabinet maker, unless they specialized just in Tanegashima stocks. Oak was the typical material for the stocks on these. Calibers ranged quite substantially, and they were generally measured in monmei. Monmei is a unit of weight, equivalent to about 58 grains. So you're firing a round lead ball out of a smoothbore barrel. This would be about a 3 monmei gun. It's about a 50 caliber gun. which is relatively small. Keep in mind a 50 caliber, well, a .490 round lead ball weighs 177 grains. So we often think of 50 caliber in terms of smokeless powder, where it's quite substantially large. For a black powder smoothbore muzzleloader, 50 cal is actually not that big. Calibers on these would get up to 80 caliber or even over an inch in diameter. For military use, the heavier caliber guns were preferred. You're thinking, high 60s, 70s, 80 caliber guns. That was a true samurai's gun. The smaller stuff like this is more hunting, sport shooting, practice. Because frankly, they're easier to shoot. They weigh less, they're more comfortable, they're more fun, really. But not quite as much power. If you're going out there and you might be shooting at some armored samurai on a horse, a 75 or 80 caliber gun is going to be probably a better choice for you. Apparently, most of these are actually marked with a name of a manufacturer, or at least a province of manufacturer. I don't see anything like that on here, so I don't have any way to identify the specific region that this came out of or date. Now, these have been in manufacture since the 1540s in Japan, but most of the survivors today, the existing guns, were probably made sometime between the late 1700s and the late 1800s. When Japan reopens itself to the West in the mid-1800s, they start getting new firearms technology. There is actually a brief period where you will see Tanegashima that have percussion locks on them, but that's a really niche, rare thing. They continued to make the traditional style of gun just like this until the late 1800s. I've actually been wanting to film a Tanegashima for quite a while. Needless to say, they're not very common here in the US. Hopefully at some point I'll be able to find some like some of the shorter carbine ones, some of the longer wall gun types, and fill in the story a bit for you guys. But it was really cool that Morphy's got this really nice example of a very standard, normal Tanegashima. This is very representative of the type. Now, if you're looking for more information on these, the book that I can absolutely recommend, and about the only book that I'm aware of that does well on the subject, is The Japanese Matchlocks Story of the Tanegashima by Shigeo Sugawa, who is a renowned expert on Japanese small arms and is in particular, or was when he wrote this book back in 1990, a shooter and collector of Tanegashima. The book is long out of print, but there are copies out there, or at least there were when I recorded this. So if you want more information, that's your reference. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. I'll look at something a little bit different in firearms technology. Thanks for watching.